Imagine it is the 14th of May, 2019. You are a 26-year-old elementary school teacher living in Columbus, Ohio. Your apartment is small but tidy. You have a used car that runs most of the time. You make $38,000 a year. And every single month, before you buy groceries, before you pay rent, before you do anything, you send $412 to a loan servicer whose name you can barely remember signing with. You have been doing this for 4 years. You still owe more than you borrowed. Not because you missed payments, not because you were irresponsible, because the math was broken before you ever sat down to take the exam. If you have ever wondered why an entire generation of educated, employed, hardworking people cannot seem to get ahead no matter what they do, stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a theory cooked up in a think tank. It is a pattern. It has played out before across different countries and different decades, wearing different clothes, but always ending in the same place. A generation trapped, an economy quietly hollowed out, a system that rewarded debt while punishing the people who carried it. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of patterns that most people never see until it is too late. Now back to Columbus, Ohio. That teacher, someone just like millions of real people in America right now, is not failing. She is doing everything she was told to do. She went to college. She got the degree. She took the job that society told her mattered. And yet every morning, she opens her banking app and watches the same number barely move. Her loan balance. It sits there like a stone she agreed to carry uphill forever. This video is about that stone. It is about how it got there, who put it there, what happens to economies when enough people are carrying it, and what history tells us about where this road leads. Because the student debt crisis in the United States is not just a personal finance problem. It is not just a political debate. It is a structural economic mechanism that history has seen before. Not with student loans specifically, but with the same engine underneath. Debt that grows faster than income. Debt tied to a credential that was supposed to guarantee prosperity. Debt that becomes a tax on the future. And when you understand what happened in other countries when that mechanism ran long enough, the picture becomes both clearer and much harder to look away from. Before we go further, there is something important to understand about how this kind of debt works at a system level, because it is not obvious, and getting it wrong means missing the whole point. Most people think of debt as a simple transaction. You borrow money, you pay it back, end of story. But student debt in America does not behave like most debt. It behaves more like a slow drain in the floor of an economy. Think of an economy as a house with water flowing through it constantly. That water is spending. It moves through pipes, it fills rooms, it keeps things alive. Now imagine someone drilled a small hole in the floor. At first, barely any water is lost. You do not even notice. But the hole does not stay small. It widens. And every year that goes by, more water disappears through the floor before it can do anything useful. That is what student debt does to consumer spending at scale. It takes money that would have gone into the economy, into mortgages, into small businesses, into savings, into children, and it routes it directly to servicers and bondholders, silently, every month, for decades. The mechanism works like this. A young person borrows money to attend college at 18 or 22 years old. They are promised, directly or implicitly, that the credential they earn will translate into income that makes the debt worthwhile. The income arrives, but it does not grow as fast as the debt did. Interest compounds. Salaries in many fields stagnate. Housing costs rise. And the graduate finds themselves in a position where they are technically employed and technically functioning, but economically paralyzed. They cannot save. They cannot invest. They delay marriage, delay children, delay buying homes. And here is the part that most analysis misses entirely. When millions of people delay those things simultaneously, the ripple effects are not personal, they are structural. They reshape industries, demographics, tax bases, and eventually the political foundation of the society itself. History shows us this repeatedly. Let us begin with the evidence. This brings us directly to the first major case study, and it comes from a country that most Americans would not immediately think to compare themselves to. Japan, specifically Japan. In the decade after 1991, Japan's post-war economic miracle was one of the greatest stories of national reinvention in modern history. By the mid-1980s, Japan was the second largest economy in the world. Land prices in Tokyo had become almost incomprehensible. Japanese companies were buying American landmarks. The Nikkei index hit nearly 40,000 points on the last trading day of 1989. And at the center of this entire miracle was a belief system. Work hard, get educated, get credentialed, join a company, be loyal, and the system will take care of you. Then the floor gave way. Between 1991 and 2003, Japanese asset prices collapsed. Real estate fell by more than 60% in some areas. The Nikkei lost more than half its value. Banks that had lent against inflated collateral suddenly found themselves holding loans worth far more than the assets backing them. They did not admit it. They called these bad loans by careful names and kept them on their books. Economists later called this the zombie bank problem. Banks that were technically dead, but still operating. Refusing to lend, refusing to let the system heal. But here is the part of Japan's story that connects directly to what we are discussing today. The generation that entered the workforce during and after this collapse faced the employment ice age. Hundreds of thousands of young Japanese people could not find stable employment. They took contract work, temporary positions, part-time jobs with no security and no path forward. These people became known as freeders, combining the English word free with the German word arbiter. By 2003, estimates suggested roughly 2 million Japanese workers were classified this way. What did this do to Japan's economy? It hollowed out the consumer base. Young people who could not find stable work could not form households. Japan's marriage rate fell, its birth rate fell, its domestic consumption fell, and the economy entered the lost decade. Except it was not really one decade. It stretched into 2, then arguably into 3. Not because Japan lacked resources or intelligence, but because a generation was sidelined. They carried a different kind of invisible debt, not in dollars, but in lost opportunity. The mechanism was identical to what student debt creates in America today, a generation that is present but economically neutralized. This leads to the second part of this story, where the comparison becomes more uncomfortable. Here's something I want you to think about before we go further. If you graduated from college in America between 2008 and 2018, what did your first 5 years in the workforce actually look like compared to what you were promised? Drop your answer in the comments, seriously, not because it is a poll, but because the pattern is historical. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear, and it changes how you see the numbers entirely. Let us go to the United Kingdom in the 1970s, specifically to the graduate labor market of 1976 and 1977. Britain was in the grip of a credentialing crisis that most people have forgotten. After the expansion of university education in the 1960s, graduates roughly tripled in 15 years. Governments and universities had made an implicit promise: more education equals more prosperity. More graduates equals a more advanced economy. It sounded reasonable. It was not entirely wrong. But it outran the economy's ability to absorb the graduates it was producing. By 1976, the unemployment rate among recent British graduates had risen to shocking levels. Young people with degrees in sociology and humanities found themselves competing for jobs that did not require them. A civil servant named Michael Young wrote that the country had created a credentialing trap. The degree had become necessary without becoming sufficient. You had to have it, but it guaranteed nothing. In 1977, the British government introduced graduate employment schemes to absorb the surplus. This worked in the short term. It did not solve the underlying mechanism. The credential had been inflated. Its real-world value had dropped, but the cost had not. Now here is what made Britain's situation slightly different from America's present moment. British students in the 1970s were not taking on individual debt to finance their degrees. The state was bearing that cost. When the bubble deflated, it was a social and political crisis. But it was not a personal financial catastrophe for each individual graduate. The pain was distributed. In America's version, the pain is not distributed. It is loaded entirely onto the individual. Every graduate carries their own version of a failed bet for 30 years. Now we go to Argentina, not the 2001 default, but the period between 1991 and 1999. The country adopted a currency board that pegged the Argentine peso directly to the dollar. This policy was called convertibility and sold as the cure for hyperinflation. Inflation had reached 3,000% per year by 1989. Prices were rising twice a day. Convertibility stopped that. Inflation collapsed. Foreign investment poured in. The middle class expanded. Argentina was declared a model economy. But underneath, the mechanism was rotting. The peso was locked to the dollar and became uncompetitive. Its trade deficit widened. To cover the gap, the government, corporations, and banks borrowed. The entire system borrowed in dollars until the moment it was not safe anymore. When the peg broke in 2002, a middle-class Argentine's debt effectively doubled overnight. The peso devalued by 70%. Manageable loans became impossible. Savings accounts were frozen and converted at unfavorable rates in the Corralito. The parallel to American student debt is a debt denominated in one currency while income is in another. Student loans are borrowed against a future salary that was promised to be large. When that salary does not materialize, the borrower faces a structural gap they cannot close. The Argentine middle class failed because they trusted a system whose math had already stopped working. Most people will hear student debt crisis and think of it as a political football, but you understand it as an economic mechanism with a historical fingerprint. Japan's lost generation, Britain's credential inflation, Argentina's denominated gap, all converge. Now observe what all of these cases have in common. 3 different countries in decades. In each case, a system made a large implicit promise that prosperity will follow investment. In each case, the math of that promise quietly stopped working before the people realized it. The cost was loaded onto the individuals, causing a decade of suppressed consumption and birth rates. The United States in 2024 carries a student debt load of approximately $1.7 trillion. That number gets repeated so often it has lost its weight. So let us give it weight. $1.7 trillion is larger than the entire gross domestic product of Australia. It is larger than the GDP of Spain. It is larger than the combined GDP of Argentina, Egypt, and South Africa combined. And unlike mortgage debt, which is backed by an asset that can theoretically be sold, student debt is backed by a credential whose market value has been declining in real terms in many fields for 2 decades. There is no house to foreclose on. There is no collateral to seize. There is only a monthly payment extracted from a person's earnings indefinitely. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The mechanism is not unique to America. The outcome is not random. And the question of who gets hurt and who walks away is not a matter of luck. It is a matter of where you were standing when the math stopped adding up. And this is where history gets uncomfortable, because the human cost of these patterns is never evenly distributed. It never has been. In every case we have examined, and in the American student debt crisis specifically, the damage lands hardest on 3 groups. And understanding who they are is the most important part of this entire video. The first group is graduates, who borrowed heavily for degrees in fields that the market did not reward. This is not a criticism. It is a structural observation. When a society tells its young people that any degree from any accredited institution is a path to prosperity, and then prices those degrees at $50,000, $80,000, or $120,000, while the earnings in many of those fields remain flat, it has created a system with a guaranteed cohort of losers. Not because those people were foolish, but because the math selected them. Teachers, social workers, artists, journalists, humanities graduates, people who chose fields that society claims to value but does not compensate accordingly. They carry the same debt as the software engineer, but without the salary to service it. In 2022, the average starting salary for a social worker in the United States was approximately $37,000 annually. The average debt load for a master's degree in social work was approximately $78,000. The mathematics of those 2 numbers in the same sentence requires no further commentary. The second group is first-generation college students. The historical record on this is consistent and brutal. First-generation students, those who are the first in their family to attend college, are statistically more likely to attend for-profit institutions, more likely to borrow at higher interest rates, less likely to graduate on time due to work obligations, and less likely to have family networks that can soften the blow when the credential does not pay off as promised. Britain's 1970s credentialing crisis hit hardest among working-class graduates, who had used the university expansion to enter fields that then became saturated. Argentina's 2002 crisis wiped out most viciously the people who had no dollar-denominated assets, no property abroad, no private safety net. The pattern holds. Those without existing capital absorb the most damage. The third group is women, not because of anything intrinsic, but because of 2 intersecting realities. Women in America now earn the majority of college degrees, roughly 57% as of recent years. And women still earn, on average, 83 cents for every dollar a man earns in comparable roles, which means women are more likely to carry student debt and less likely to have the income velocity to pay it down quickly. A gap that was supposed to close by now has instead been leveraged against the group it was supposed to help. Now contrast this with who walked away from these events relatively intact. In Japan's lost decade, the established salaried class, those who had entered the workforce before 1991 and held permanent positions, largely kept their jobs and their pensions. Their real estate lost value on paper, but they continued earning and spending. In Argentina, those who had dollar accounts outside the banking system, or who held physical assets like agricultural land, absorbed the devaluation without the fatal personal math. In Britain, graduates in law, medicine, engineering, and technical fields found that credential inflation had not reached their sectors with the same force. The degree still paid off because the market for their skills had remained tight. The historical record shows with uncomfortable consistency that in every structural economic crisis driven by debt and credential inflation, those with existing assets, existing networks, and existing professional credentials in high-demand fields emerge largely intact, not because they were smarter or worked harder, but because they were already inside the wall when the gate closed. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The question is what individuals who are living inside this mechanism right now can observe from the historical record of those who came through similar moments. If this channel has given you a way of seeing the structure beneath the surface, subscribe. It costs nothing. And the ability to recognize a pattern before it fully reveals itself is one of the most durable advantages a person can carry. Because what I am about to describe in the next section is not advice. It is a description of what the people who came through Japan's lost decade, Britain's credential squeeze, and Argentina's peso trap had in common. And some of those things are not what you would expect. The historical record shows that those who navigated through periods of credential inflation and debt-driven economic stagnation largely shared a small number of observable characteristics. Not wealth, not luck, not exceptional intelligence, observable patterns of behavior and positioning that the record documents across multiple cases. The first pattern is that survivors of Japan's employment ice age who built durable economic lives were disproportionately those who acquired skills that could be applied across multiple sectors, rather than credentials tied to a single industry. The freeder generation that managed to escape the precariat in Japan's 1990s and early 2000s were often those who had pursued technical skills, trades, language skills, or entrepreneurial paths that the formal credential system had not officially endorsed, but the market continued to value. The credential bubble had deflated, but specific, demonstrable skill had not. This pattern repeats in Britain. The graduates who fared best in the 1970s saturation were those whose degree was a foundation for a skill, not a substitute for one. The second pattern is diversification of income sources. In Argentina between 1999 and 2002, as the peso's fate became slowly more apparent to those who were watching carefully, the households that came through least damaged were those that had found ways to generate income in more than one form. Not necessarily income in foreign currency, though that helped too, but income that was not entirely dependent on a single employer, a single contract, or a single form of stability. This is not a recommendation to any specific action. It is a historical observation. The historical record of economic disruption across the 20th century consistently shows that households with more than one income stream have a materially different experience of crisis than those with only one. The third pattern is perhaps the most counterintuitive, and it shows up clearly in both Japan and Argentina. The individuals who came through economic stagnation with the most clarity, not necessarily the most wealth, but the most clarity, were those who had developed an accurate and unsentimental understanding of the system they were inside. In Japan, workers who recognized early that the implied social contract of lifetime employment had broken, and who adjusted their planning accordingly rather than waiting for a system that was no longer functioning as promised, made materially different decisions than those who continued to operate under the old assumptions. In Argentina, those who understood that the peg was a mathematical impossibility before it broke in 2002 had time to reposition. Not all of them did, but those who did had the advantage not of wealth or insider knowledge, but of clear pattern recognition. History is not a fortune-telling machine, but it is a pattern library, and the most important thing about libraries is that you have to actually read them. Now let us come back to Columbus, Ohio, May 2019. That 26-year-old teacher sitting in her apartment. Her name for the purpose of this story is Sarah. She is not a statistic. She is a real archetype, assembled from the documented experiences of hundreds of thousands of Americans whose situations have been recorded in surveys, in academic research, in congressional testimony and bankruptcy filings, and in the kinds of quiet personal stories that do not make headlines but compose the actual texture of an economy. Sarah kept making her payments every month, $412. She refinanced once when the interest rate environment allowed it. She took a second part-time tutoring job on weekends to create a second income stream. She did not buy a house in 2019 or 2020, not because she did not want to, but because the debt-to-income ratio made approval nearly impossible. She delayed having children not as a philosophical choice, but as a mathematical one. She is 31 now. Her balance has fallen, slowly, the way a stone erodes in a river, imperceptibly but measurably. What happened to the Japanese freeder of 1995? Many of them are now in their late 40s and early 50s, carrying into middle age the earnings and savings deficits of a decade of precarious work that permanently bent the arc of their economic lives. Japan's government has produced report after report documenting this generational scar. It does not go away on its own. What happened to the Argentine middle-class family that had borrowed in dollars by 2001? Some rebuilt, many did not. The ones who rebuilt were generally those who had something tangible to trade on: land, a trade skill, a product the world still wanted. The ones who did not rebuild were those whose only asset was their credential and their trust in the system that had underpinned it. The lesson is not that systems always collapse. It is not that debt always destroys. It is something quieter and more precise than either of those. The lesson is that when a society builds a pathway to prosperity that requires young people to take on large, non-dischargeable debt, which means debt that cannot be erased even in bankruptcy, in exchange for a credential whose real market value has been allowed to erode by inflation, wage stagnation, and oversupply, while the institutions offering that credential face no financial consequence for inability to repay. You have built a mechanism with a predictable outcome, not an inevitable catastrophe, but a guaranteed transfer of wealth, of time, of human potential, from the generation carrying the debt to the institutions and bondholders holding it. History has seen this before, not in this exact form, but in this exact structure. And the structure does not care what country it is operating in. It does not care about the politics of the people inside it. It simply produces the outcome the mathematics requires. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different in ways that only a qualified professional who knows their specific circumstances can properly assess. Please consult a qualified financial professional before making any financial decision based on anything discussed in this video. This video is not for everyone. Most people will scroll past it. Most people will not sit with these 3 case studies long enough to feel the pattern underneath them. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. If you have a younger sibling about to sign a loan they do not fully understand, if you have a friend who thinks their situation is a personal failure, share this with them. Not because it changes what has already happened, but because understanding a mechanism is the first step toward not being blindsided by it twice. Subscribe for more of this kind of historical clarity, and I will see you in the next one.